Hi lovelies! Our cozy fall soup series continues today with one of my very favorite hearty and satisfying recipes. It's Pasta Fagioli Soup. Now, if you have never had the pleasure of trying this soup for yourself, you are in for such a treat. It's nutrient rich, full of fiber, and filling thanks to the addition of both pasta and beans. In fact, pasta fagioli is basically a direct translation for pasta and beans, which is the base of this soup. And it's actually really simple to prepare. So to get started, I have got a little bit of olive oil heating up over medium-high heat in a nice big soup pot on the stove. Now, if you don't have one of these already, I highly recommend investing in one. It's one of the kitchen tools that I use the most year after year, and you don't have to splurge for a super expensive one. You can get one for under $50 like this one was. And I'm gonna get started by browning my ground beef. Once that beef is in the pot, I'm gonna go ahead and break it up into little bits using the side of my spoon, and I wanna season it liberally with a little salt and a little pepper. I've opted for some extra lean ground beef here, and that's always a good idea in a soup like this because you don't want a lot of extra fat floating around in your soup. This is a really good place to use as lean a beef as you can find. Now, if you don't wanna use meat in this recipe, you definitely have the option to leave it out. I've also seen this made with Italian sausage. You could use hot or mild, both would be really tasty. You could also lighten this up a little bit by using some ground poultry instead, so some turkey or some chicken if you wanted to. Or you also have the option to just leave the meat out entirely and keep this vegetarian. Totally up to you. Just as soon as that beef is nice and brown, we're gonna go ahead and start building in our flavor here. And to do that, I'm starting with a traditional mirepoix. That's what they call this classic mixture of onion, celery, and carrots. Tons of great flavor, plus tons of great nutrients as well. And we just wanna let these cook up for another, say, 3 to 4 minutes or until they're nice and soft. Then it's time to add even more great flavor to this, and I'm going to be doing that courtesy of some garlic. Now, I think I mentioned this in my last video, but it's worth mentioning again. We have been plagued by cold season in our house. My daughter Ella's in daycare, and so we basically pick up everything that's going around the daycare. And needless to say, everyone has been sick pretty much consistently for a month. So soup has been our savior. I always like to add tons of garlic to my soup because garlic has lots of immunity boosting power, and that is something we could really use around our house right now. I also want to get in here with even more great flavor, and to do that, I'm going to be adding an Italian seasoning that's loaded with dried herbs like thyme, oregano, parsley, and basil. You can use homemade or store-bought. Both work really well in this recipe. And I'll just let that seasoning heat up for another minute or so to help it really maximize its flavor. You won't believe how good this already smells. Super soothing to the soul. Then it's time to go ahead and add my beans to the pot. In this case, I'm using a combination of cannellini beans, also known as white kidney beans, as well as some red kidney beans. But to be perfectly honest, you can use whatever canned beans you have lying around in your pantry. I always have canned beans on hand because of course they're loaded with fiber, great for you, and require almost no cooking at all. What's not to love about that? Once my beans are in the pot, I'm gonna go ahead and add my tomatoes as well. So I've got some crushed tomatoes headed in here as well as some diced tomatoes because I like the two different textures happening. I'm also going to be adding some beef broth to my pot. Now you can really use any kind of broth you want in this recipe. I'm opting for beef because of course it works really well with the ground beef that we're using here. But if you were using Italian sausage or some ground poultry, you could use chicken broth or some veggie broth if you wanted to leave this vegetarian. Definitely up to you. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and add my secret ingredient, which I really believe takes this soup right over the top in terms of flavor. And my secret ingredient is actually a Parmesan rind. Now, if you don't know what this is, it's basically the piece that's left over once you've grated your full piece of Parmesan, and usually people throw them away. But what I like to do is actually save them in a zipper bag and store them in either my fridge or my freezer. And then whenever I'm making a nice savory soup like this, I just pop the whole rind right into the soup, and it imparts the most beautiful umami flavor into the soup. You won't even believe how delicious it becomes. Now at this point, I'm just gonna let this come to a nice rolling boil. And once it's reached that boil, I wanna go ahead and add my pasta to this. And here I'm using traditional d'Italia pasta. That's super classic in this soup. Super classic in this soup, super classic. But you can really use any kind of small pasta you wanted to. You could use some macaroni, some mini shells, or even some orzo if that's what you have on hand. And basically what we're going to do is let those shells cook away in that delicious broth until they're nice and tender. That usually takes between say 10 and 12 minutes. Now, some people would tell you to cook your shells in a separate pot and then add them to your soup, but I just add an extra cup or two of broth to compensate for the fact that my shells are going to absorb a lot of that liquid, and that way I don't have to dirty any more dishes because guys, let's be honest, I have 2 kids. I've already got plenty of dishes to do. So while that pasta is boiling and bubbling away, I'm going to go ahead and add my second secret ingredient, and that is just a little bit of sugar. So I've got about 2 teaspoons here, and I'm going to sprinkle it into my pot. I know this seems totally counterintuitive in a savory recipe like this, but that sugar is just going to help cut the acidity of those tomatoes just a little bit. You're not even going to be able to detect it. It's not gonna make your soup sweet or anything, but it's going to mellow out that acidity quite a bit. So I highly recommend adding it to your pot. And just as soon as that pasta is fully cooked, this soup is ready to be enjoyed. I like going in and removing my Parmesan rind because of course it's done all its hard work. And honestly, it is ready for serving. I like finishing it off with some freshly chopped parsley just for a bit of green and freshness, as well as some freshly grated Parmesan cheese, because honestly guys, what is not made better with freshly grated Parmesan? Am I right? Some people call this a soup. I think it eats a lot more like a stew. Regardless, it is one of the most delicious things you will eat this fall, I promise you that. In fact, I'm ready to have a bowl right now. This soup is so hearty, flavorful, and satisfying. It totally eats like a meal. It's the perfect thing on a chilly fall day. The flavor is so good, your entire family is sure to love it. And I hope you will give it a try for yourselves. If you do, be sure to tweet me, Instagram me, or Facebook me a photo because you know how much I love seeing your kitchen creations. Remember, this recipe, like all of my recipes, is featured on healthymealplans.com, our amazing meal planning site that allows you to browse more than 1,000 recipes, drag and drop them into your weekly meal plan, and then automatically generates your grocery list for the week. What's not to like? Finally, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe because there is lots more deliciousness where this came from.